The maintenance bay of the starship Celestial Dawn hummed with the sound of plasma welders and hydraulic lifts. Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of engine grease across his dark skin. He had been working on the ship's fusion drive for 12 hours straight, but the stubborn cooling system refused to cooperate. Around him, the other mechanics went about their duties with practiced efficiency. Most were from different species across the galaxy. Tall, blue-skinned Altarians with their 4 arms, stocky Kraxan miners with their rock-hard carapaces, and even a few ethereal Valans who seemed to float rather than walk. But Jake was the only human aboard the massive vessel. Humans were still considered a young species in galactic terms. Earth had only joined the Galactic Federation 50 years ago, and most aliens still viewed humanity with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. They saw humans as crude, emotional creatures who relied more on luck than skill. Jake didn't mind the attitude. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. While other mechanics used expensive diagnostic equipment and advanced AI systems, Jake could often identify problems just by listening to the subtle changes in an engine's rhythm or feeling the vibrations through the ship's hull. The massive bay doors suddenly opened with a thunderous crash, and Jake looked up from his work. A sleek, obsidian-black shuttle glided into the bay, its hull gleaming under the bright work lights. The craft was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and strange symbols glowed along its edges with an inner fire. As the shuttle settled onto the deck with barely a whisper, Jake felt a change in the atmosphere. The other mechanics had stopped working and were backing away from the new arrival. Even the normally fearless Kraxan miners were retreating to safe distances. "What's got everyone spooked?" Jake asked Zenth, an Altarian mechanic who had worked on the ship for decades. Zenth's 4 eyes went wide with terror. "Dragon ship," he whispered, his translator struggling to convey the fear in his voice. "Solareth dragons. They rarely leave their home system, and when they do—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jake had heard stories about the dragons, of course. They were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy, possessing technology that bordered on magic. Their ships could travel between stars without using jump gates, and their warriors were said to be unstoppable in battle. But most importantly, they were incredibly proud and looked down on all other species as inferior. The shuttle's hatch opened with a hiss, and a figure emerged that took Jake's breath away. She was tall, easily 7 feet, with an elegant humanoid form wrapped in what looked like living shadow. Her skin had a subtle scaled pattern that caught the light like polished obsidian, and her hair flowed like liquid silver down her back. But it was her eyes that truly marked her as one of the dragon kind. They glowed with an inner fire that seemed to look right through him. She wore robes that seemed to shift and move on their own, decorated with intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Around her neck hung a pendant that pulsed with the same inner light as her eyes. The Dragoness surveyed the maintenance bay with obvious disdain, her gaze passing over the various mechanics as if they were barely worth noticing. When her eyes finally settled on Jake, he felt a chill run down his spine. "I am Virolith of the House of Burning Stars," she announced, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air tremble. "My vessel requires maintenance before I continue to the Centauri negotiations. I demand your finest technician." The bay supervisor, a nervous Vorthon named Krex, immediately stepped forward. "Of course, Lady Virolith. We have several master-certified mechanics who would be honored to—" "No," Virolith interrupted, pointing directly at Jake. "That one, the human." Jake felt every eye in the bay turn toward him. Several of his colleagues looked shocked, while others seemed relieved that they hadn't been chosen. "My lady," Krex stammered, "surely you would prefer someone with more experience with dragon technology? This human is skilled, but—" Are you questioning my judgment? The temperature in the bay seemed to drop several degrees as Viraleth's eyes flared brighter. No, my lady. Of course not. Krex quickly gestured to Jake. Martinez, you've been selected for special duty. Jake set down his tools and walked over to the Dragon shuttle, trying to project more confidence than he felt. Up close, Viraleth was even more intimidating. He could feel the power radiating from her like heat from a forge. What seems to be the problem? He asked, keeping his voice steady. Viraleth raised an eyebrow, apparently surprised by his direct approach. The harmonic resonance chamber is producing discordant frequencies. It should sing in perfect harmony, but instead it creates noise. Jake nodded and approached the shuttle. The moment his hand touched the hull, he could feel it. The ship was alive in some way, its biomechanical systems pulsing with their own rhythm. But she was right. There was definitely something wrong with the harmony. May I go aboard? He asked. You may, Viraleth replied, though she sounded skeptical about his chances of success. The interior of the shuttle was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The walls seemed to be grown rather than built, with veins of light running through organic-looking conduits. Everything pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm like a massive heartbeat. Jake made his way to what he assumed was the engine compartment, following the discordant sound that only he seemed to be able to hear clearly. The harmonic resonance chamber was a beautiful crystalline structure that sat at the heart of the ship, surrounded by delicate filaments that vibrated in complex patterns. As he examined the chamber, Jake began to understand the problem. The crystals weren't just producing sound, they were singing, each one contributing its voice to a greater harmony. But several of the smaller crystals had shifted slightly out of alignment, creating interference patterns that disrupted the whole song. Working carefully, Jake began to adjust the crystal formations. He had no training in dragon technology, but he could feel the correct positions through the vibrations in his hands. Each small adjustment brought the song closer to perfection. It took him nearly an hour of delicate work, but finally the last crystal slipped into place. Suddenly, the entire chamber burst into song. Not just sound, but something that seemed to resonate in his very bones. The harmony was so perfect, so beautiful, that it brought tears to his eyes. When Jake emerged from the shuttle, he found Viraleth waiting for him with an unreadable expression. "It is done?" she asked. "Should be singing perfectly now," Jake replied. Viraleth closed her eyes and listened. For a long moment, there was silence in the bay except for the distant hum of machinery. Then her eyes snapped open, and for the first time, she looked genuinely surprised. "Impossible," she whispered. "How could a human understand dragon song?" Before Jake could answer, she continued. "Our greatest technicians trained for centuries to achieve such harmony. You accomplished it in mere minutes." The other mechanics had gathered at a safe distance, watching the exchange with fascination. None of them had ever seen a dragon show surprise before. "It wasn't that complicated," Jake said with a shrug. "Just had to listen to what the ship was trying to tell me." Viraleth stared at him for a long moment, her fiery eyes studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. "What is your name, human?" "Jake Martinez." "Jake Martinez," she repeated slowly, as if testing how the syllables felt. "You have done something no non-dragon has ever accomplished. Perhaps there is more to your species than we believed." She turned to leave, then paused at the shuttle's hatch. "Tell me, Jake Martinez, do you have any other talents?" Jake thought about it for a moment. Back on Earth, he had been something of a musician before joining the merchant fleet. He still carried his guitar in his personal quarters, though he rarely had time to play anymore. "I play a little music," he said finally. Viraleth's expression changed dramatically. Her eyes narrowed, and something that might have been amusement flickered across her features. "Music?" she asked. What kind of music? Old Earth songs mostly. Folk music, blues, some rock. Nothing fancy. To Jake's surprise, Viroleth actually laughed. A sound like silver bells mixed with distant thunder. How amusing, she said. A human who thinks he can create music. We dragons have been the masters of harmony since before your species learned to make fire. Our songs can shatter mountains and calm stellar storms. She stepped closer, and Jake could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I suppose you think your primitive noise-making could compare to true dragon song? There was a challenge in her voice that made Jake's spine straighten. He had faced down plenty of bullies in his life, and he recognized the tone. Music is music, he said quietly. Doesn't matter what species makes it, as long as it comes from the heart. Viroleth's laughter was sharper this time. How delightfully naive. Very well, little human. I am curious to hear what your kind considers music. She gestured grandly, her robes swirling around her. Play something for me. Right here, right now. Show me this music from the heart. Jake glanced around the maintenance bay. Every mechanic was watching now, sensing that something significant was happening. The challenge in Viroleth's voice was clear to everyone present. I don't have my guitar with me, Jake said. Then fetch it, Viroleth commanded. I have time. Jake hesitated. He had a feeling that this was about more than just music. There was something in the Dragoness's eyes, a test of some kind. And if I play? He asked. Viroleth's smile was predatory. If you can produce something that even approaches true music, something that moves me in the slightest, then I will acknowledge that perhaps humans are not completely worthless. And if I can't? Then you will have proven what we dragons have always known, that humans are nothing more than clever animals pretending at civilization. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt his temper starting to rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help anything. What if I surprise you? He asked quietly. Viroleth's eyes glowed brighter. Impossible. But if somehow your primitive noise-making managed to truly impress me, she paused dramatically. I suppose I would owe you a debt. What would you want from a dragon, little human? Jake was about to suggest something simple, but the words that came out of his mouth surprised even him. Play it, and I'll marry you. The silence that followed was deafening. Every being in the maintenance bay went completely still, as if afraid that any movement might trigger an explosion. Viroleth's eyes went wide with shock, then narrowed dangerously. For a moment, Jake thought she might incinerate him on the spot. Then, incredibly, she began to laugh again. But this time it was different, not mocking, but genuinely amused. How unexpected, she said finally. No being has ever been so bold with me before. Very well, Jake Martinez, I accept your wager. She stepped even closer, until they were almost touching. Jake could smell something like cinnamon and starfire on her breath. But understand this, she said softly. I am Viroleth of the House of Burning Stars. My family's bloodline reaches back 10,000 years. I have turned down marriage proposals from emperors and star lords. What makes you think your simple human music could possibly move me enough to consider such a thing? Jake met her gaze steadily. Guess we'll find out. Viroleth smiled, and for the first time it didn't look predatory. Indeed we will. Go fetch your instrument, bold human. Let us see if your heart can sing loudly enough for a dragon to hear. Jake's quarters were small and utilitarian, like most crew accommodations on merchant vessels. But in the corner, carefully secured in a protective case, sat his most prized possession, a battered acoustic guitar that had belonged to his grandfather. His hands shook slightly as he opened the case. The guitar was old, its wood worn smooth by decades of playing, but it had a warm, rich tone that no modern synthetic instrument could match. Jake had learned to play on this very guitar, sitting on his grandfather's porch in rural Texas, listening to stories of the old days when humans still lived only on Earth. As he lifted the instrument, memories flooded back. His grandfather had been a traveling musician before settling down, and he had filled young Jake's head with tales of music's power to bring people together, to heal wounds, and to bridge any gap. "Music doesn't care about borders, boy," the old man had said. "It speaks to something deeper than words ever could." Jake hoped that was true, because he was about to test that theory with the most dangerous audience imaginable. When he returned to the maintenance bay, he found that word had spread throughout the ship. What had started as a small group of mechanics had grown into a crowd of nearly 100 beings from dozens of different species. They lined the walkways and platforms, all watching with fascination as the drama unfolded. Virolith stood exactly where he had left her, apparently unmoved, but Jake noticed that she had changed somehow. Her robes now seemed to shimmer with inner fire, and the pendant around her neck pulsed with a steady rhythm. "So," she said as Jake approached, "the human returns. I was beginning to think you had decided to flee." "Just getting my guitar," Jake replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. Virolith gestured to the open space in the center of the bay. "Very well. The stage is yours, Jake Martinez. Show me what human music sounds like." Jake walked to the center of the circle that had formed around them. The crowd fell silent, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. Some looked excited, others skeptical. A few of the alien faces showed open concern, as if they expected him to be vaporized at any moment. He settled the guitar strap over his shoulder and checked the tuning. The familiar weight of the instrument was comforting, grounding him in something real and solid. "Any requests?" he asked, looking at Virolith. The Dragoness tilted her head slightly. "Play whatever you believe will prove your point, human. Though I warn you, I have heard the songs of stellar choirs and the harmonies of crystalline beings whose voices can resonate across star systems. Your chances of impressing me are minimal." Jake nodded and thought about what to play. He could choose something technically impressive, something that would show off his skill with the instrument. But somehow he didn't think that was what this moment called for. Instead, he thought about his grandfather's words, music that spoke to something deeper than words, music that brought people together. He began with a simple chord progression, letting his fingers find their way across the strings. The acoustic guitar rang out clearly in the vast space of the maintenance bay, each note hanging in the air before blending into the next. Then he began to play "The Water is Wide," an old Earth ballad that had been sung for centuries in a dozen different languages. It was a simple song, really, just a melody about longing and distance, about the spaces between people and the hope of crossing them. But as Jake played, something magical began to happen. The mechanics around the bay slowly stopped talking and turned to listen. The melody seemed to resonate in the metal walls, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the ship's heating systems. Jake closed his eyes and let himself fall into the music. He thought about all the lonely nights in space, all the times he had missed Earth and family and the simple pleasure of sitting under open skies. He thought about the vast distances between worlds, between species, between hearts. As he played, he became aware that something was changing in the bay. The usual background hum of machinery seemed to quiet, as if the ship itself was listening. When he opened his eyes, he saw that even the typically stoic Kraxon miners were swaying slightly to the rhythm, but it was Virolith who captured his attention. The Dragoness stood perfectly still, her glowing eyes fixed on him with an expression he couldn't read. The fire in her gaze seemed to have softened somehow, though it burned no less brightly. Jake transitioned into another song, this one even older. Scarborough Fair, a medieval ballad that spoke of love and time and the bittersweet nature of memory. His voice, rough from years of working in engine rooms, joined the guitar in harmony. As he sang, he noticed something remarkable. Other voices began to join in, not with words, because most of the aliens didn't know the language, but with wordless harmonies that somehow fit perfectly with the melody. The Altarians hummed in their bass voices, while the ethereal Velans added high, crystal-clear tones. Even some of the usually silent machinery operators from the upper levels had gathered to listen, adding their own species' musical traditions to the growing chorus. But through it all, Virolith remained silent and motionless, watching. Jake decided to take a risk. For his final song, he chose something he had never performed in public before, a song he had written himself during one of the loneliest periods of his life, when he first left Earth to work in space. It was called Gravity Well, and it was about the pull of home that every traveler feels, the invisible force that always tries to draw you back to familiar ground. But it was also about the courage to keep moving forward, to explore new worlds and meet new people, even when it meant leaving everything you knew behind. As Jake played, he found himself looking directly at Virolith. The words seemed to be meant for her, as if the song was explaining something he couldn't put into words. The Dragoness's expression had changed completely now. The proud, mocking mask had fallen away, replaced by something much more vulnerable. Her eyes still glowed, but now they seemed to hold depths he hadn't noticed before. When the last note faded into silence, Jake let his hands fall away from the strings. The maintenance bay was completely quiet for a long moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with the human crew members, then spread to include beings from across the galaxy. Even the usually reserved Velans were making their species' equivalent of approval, a soft, chiming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But Jake only had eyes for Virolith. The Dragoness stood frozen in place, staring at him with an expression of complete shock. "Impossible," she whispered, so quietly that only Jake could hear her. How could anyone—" "Lady Virolith," Jake asked softly, "are you all right?" The sound of her name seemed to break whatever spell held her. Virolith straightened, and for a moment, the proud mask tried to reassert itself, but it couldn't quite hold. "That was—" she began, then stopped. "I have traveled to 1,000 worlds, Jake Martinez. I have heard the greatest musicians of 50 different species. I have listened to songs that can literally move mountains and melt the hearts of stars." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "But I have never heard anything that spoke to me the way your simple human music just did." The crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing that something momentous was happening. "The songs of my people are magnificent," Virolith continued, her voice growing stronger. "They are perfect in their mathematical precision, flawless in their harmonic complexity. But your music, it has something ours lacks." "What's that?" Jake asked. "Pain," she said simply, "and hope, and the kind of beauty that can only come from imperfection." She stepped closer, and Jake could see that her hands were trembling slightly. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you take simple chords and melody and create something that could reach across the gulf between species, between worlds, between a dragon and a human?" Jake thought about her question seriously. "I guess because music isn't really about the notes," he said finally. "It's about the feelings behind them, the experiences that shape them. Everyone who heard those songs tonight brought their own story to them, their own longing for home, their own dreams of connection." Virolith nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I think I understand now." She was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could almost see her struggling with something internal. "My people believe that dragons are superior to all other species," she said eventually. "We have told ourselves this for so long that we forgot how to listen to anyone else's voice. But tonight, She looked around at the mixed crowd of beings who had gathered to listen, all of them still watching in rapt attention. Tonight you reminded me that there are different kinds of strength, different kinds of beauty, and perhaps different kinds of wisdom. Jake felt his heart racing. Does this mean... Viroleth's smile was radiant. It means you won your wager, Jake Martinez. Your music moved me more deeply than I thought possible. But more than that... She reached up and touched the pendant at her throat. It pulsed once, then began to sing, a clear, beautiful tone that harmonized perfectly with the memory of Jake's guitar. It means you have awakened something in me that I thought was lost forever. The ability to hear music, not just with my ears, but with my heart. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Beings from dozens of species were celebrating as if they had witnessed something historic, and perhaps they had. But Jake barely heard them. All of his attention was focused on the incredible woman standing before him, her eyes blazing with an inner fire that now seemed warm rather than intimidating. "So what happens now?" he asked. Viroleth's smile was mysterious. "Now, Jake Martinez, you must decide if you truly meant what you said." "Because I am prepared to honor my part of the bargain, if you are brave enough to honor yours." Jake felt a moment of panic. Had he really proposed marriage to an alien dragon princess he had just met? The logical part of his mind screamed that this was insane. But as he looked into Viroleth's glowing eyes, he realized that logic had nothing to do with what he was feeling. Something had happened in that music, something deeper than words or reason could explain. "I meant it," he said quietly. Viroleth's smile grew even brighter. "Then we have much to discuss, my bold human musician. But perhaps we should find somewhere more private for such conversations." Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse, though many beings lingered to congratulate Jake or simply to process what they had witnessed, but Jake hardly noticed. He was too busy wondering what he had gotten himself into and whether the most beautiful, terrifying, and incredible woman he had ever met was really serious about marrying a simple human mechanic. Somehow he thought she might be. The observation lounge on Deck 7 was usually empty during the night shift, its huge windows offering a spectacular view of the star field beyond. Jake and Viroleth sat across from each other at a small table, the silence between them comfortable despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. "I should explain something about dragon marriage customs," Viroleth said, her fingers tracing patterns on the table's surface. "Among my people, marriage is not just a joining of individuals. It is a bonding of souls that can last for millennia." Jake nodded, trying to wrap his mind around the concept. "How long do dragons live?" "Those of pure bloodline can live for 10,000 years or more," she replied, though most choose to enter the deep sleep long before then, when the weight of accumulated experience becomes too much to bear. The implications of that hit Jake like a physical blow. 10,000 years? I'll be lucky to see 100. Viroleth's expression softened. "This is why my proposal is so shocking to my people. Dragons typically marry only once, and only to other dragons who can share their lifespan. To bond with a human would mean you'd outlive me by 9,900 years. Jake finished. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that reality settling between them. "There are ways," Viroleth said quietly. "Dragon magic can extend a human lifespan significantly. Not to match ours exactly, but enough for several centuries together. But the process is difficult and irreversible." Jake looked out at the stars, thinking about everything he would be leaving behind on Earth, all the people who would grow old and die while he lived on. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why would you even consider this? You barely know me." Viroleth was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if she was going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and measured. For 300 years, I have been considered one of the most eligible females of my generation, she said. Princes and star-lords have competed for my attention. Dragon nobles have written epic poems in my honor. I have been courted with gifts that could purchase entire star systems. She turned to look at Jake directly. But none of them ever saw me, Jake Martinez. They saw my bloodline, my power, my family's influence. They heard what they expected to hear when I spoke, saw what they wanted to see when they looked at me. Jake waited for her to continue. Tonight, when you played your music, you weren't trying to impress me or win my favor. You were simply sharing something true and honest from your heart. And for the first time in my very long life, someone looked at me and saw not Lady Virolith of the House of Burning Stars, but simply me. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Her skin was warm, almost fever-hot, but not unpleasantly so. You treated me as an equal, not as a goddess or a prize to be won. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Jake thought about it and realized he understood. I grew up as a poor kid from Texas. I've been looked down on plenty. I guess I figured everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what species they are. Virolith smiled. Yes, exactly that. Before Jake could respond, the lounge's communications panel chimed. A holographic display materialized above the table, showing the concerned face of Captain Reynolds, the ship's commanding officer. Martinez, there you are, the captain said. I've been looking all over for you. We've got a problem. Jake straightened. What kind of problem, sir? A big one. We've received a priority communication from the Solareth Imperium. It seems that Lady Virolith's presence here has been noted by certain interested parties. The display shifted to show a massive warship approaching their position. Jake didn't recognize the design, but he could tell it was built for war. Massive weapons arrays bristled along its hull, and energy readings suggested it carried enough firepower to level a small moon. That's the Burning Vengeance, Virolith said, her voice tight with tension. My brother Korath's ship. Your brother? Jake asked. Korath the Destroyer. He has never approved of my independence. If he has come here personally, it means he knows about our wager. Captain Reynolds nodded grimly. The warship is demanding that Lady Virolith transfer to their vessel immediately. They claim she is needed for urgent family business. Virolith stood abruptly, her robes swirling around her like smoke. This is not about family business. Korath has always believed that I should marry within our noble class to strengthen political alliances. He will not tolerate my association with a human. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean for us? It means, Virolith said quietly, that my brother will likely challenge you to single combat for the right to court me. It is an ancient tradition among our people. The captain's face on the display grew even more concerned. Lady Virolith, with all due respect, that sounds extremely dangerous for Martinez. It is, she admitted. Dragons in combat are formidable. Even the youngest of my kind possesses strength that could crush steel, breath that can melt starship hulls, and reflexes faster than most beings can perceive. Jake felt his mouth go dry. And if I refuse the challenge? Then you would be branded a coward and banned from ever setting foot in Solareth space again. More importantly, it would prove to my people that humans are indeed inferior, and any hope of a relationship between us would be impossible. The communications panel chimed again, and Captain Reynolds looked even more worried. They're requesting permission to board, he said. I can refuse, but that warship could turn this vessel into scrap metal without breaking a sweat. Virolith moved to stand beside Jake, her hand resting on his shoulder. The choice is yours, Jake Martinez. You can walk away from this now, and no one would blame you. Korath is one of the greatest warriors our people have ever produced. He has never been defeated in single combat. Jake looked at her face, seeing the mixture of hope and resignation in her glowing eyes. He thought about his grandfather's words again. Music doesn't care about borders. Maybe courage didn't either. "What are the rules of this combat?" he asked. Virolith's eyes widened. "You cannot be serious." "I'm completely serious. You said earlier that there are different kinds of strength. Maybe it's time someone proved that." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Traditional dragon combat allows each participant to fight in their preferred form and with weapons of their choosing. My brother will take his dragon shape, nearly 50 feet long with natural armor that can deflect most energy weapons. He breathes plasma hot enough to melt through starship hulls." Jake swallowed hard. "And humans get to choose weapons too?" "Yes. But Jake, no human weapon could possibly—" "I'll need my guitar," Jake interrupted. Both Virolith and Captain Reynolds stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Your guitar?" the captain said. "Son, I think you misunderstood. This is combat to the death, not a talent show." Jake smiled grimly. "Trust me, Captain. I have an idea." An hour later, Jake stood in the ship's main cargo bay, which had been cleared to serve as a combat arena. The massive space doors were open to the void, held back only by force fields that would prevent atmosphere from escaping while allowing the combatants to maneuver freely. Korath, the Destroyer, was everything Virolith had said and more. In his dragon form, he was a nightmare of obsidian scales and burning eyes, his massive wings folded against his serpentine body. When he spoke, his voice was like the rumble of an active volcano. "So this is the human who thinks himself worthy of my sister," Korath said, his massive head lowering to examine Jake more closely. "You are even smaller than I expected." Jake stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run. His guitar hung from its strap across his back, and in his hands he held something that had taken the ship's fabricators an hour to create, based on his specifications. "I didn't say I was worthy," Jake replied. "I said I was willing to try." Korath's laughter was like an avalanche. "How amusing! And what is that ridiculous contraption you're holding?" Jake looked down at the device in his hands. It looked like a guitar amplifier crossed with a harmonic resonator, built using some of the same crystalline technology he had repaired in Virolith's ship. The ship's engineers had thought he was crazy, but they had built it anyway. "It's called a sonic amplifier," Jake said. "If you don't mind, I'd like to tune up before we start." Korath gestured dismissively with one massive claw. "By all means, human. Play your little songs. When you are ready to die, let me know." Jake plugged his guitar into the amplifier and began to play. But this time, instead of the gentle melodies he had performed earlier, he chose something with more power behind it. He started with "Thunderstruck" by AC/DC, the driving rhythm and powerful chords amplified by the resonator until they seemed to shake the entire cargo bay. The harmonic crystals in the device began to glow, feeding off the musical energy and transforming it into something else entirely. Korath's expression changed from amusement to confusion as the music filled the space around them. The sound waves, amplified and focused by the crystalline technology, began to create visible distortions in the air. Jake transitioned into "The Devil Went Down to Georgia," his fingers flying across the strings with desperate precision. The amplifier translated every note into a cascade of harmonic energy that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space itself. But it was when he began to play "Freebird" that something extraordinary happened. The crystalline amplifier began to sing along with the guitar, its harmonic frequencies matching and enhancing every note. The sound became something more than music. It became a force of nature, a sonic hurricane that filled the cargo bay with pure acoustic power. Korath tried to advance, but the wall of sound held him back like a physical barrier. His plasma breath, when he tried to use it, was dispersed and scattered by the harmonic interference. "Impossible!" he roared, but his voice was lost in the hurricane of music. Jake played as he had never played before, pouring every emotion, every memory, every hope and fear into the performance. The guitar sang of Earth's blue skies and distant stars, of loneliness and connection, of the courage to reach across impossible distances for love. And something magical happened. The other beings watching from the observation galleries began to sing along. Not with words, but with their hearts. The song became a chorus of a dozen different species, all united in harmony despite their differences. Korath found himself caught in the web of that harmony, his rage and aggression slowly giving way to something else. For the first time in centuries, the great dragon warrior remembered what it felt like to be moved by beauty rather than driven by conquest. When the last note finally faded into silence, Korath stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to change. His massive dragon form shrank and shifted until he stood before them in humanoid shape, tall and proud like his sister, but with the bearing of a warrior rather than a diplomat. "I concede," he said simply. The cargo bay erupted in cheers and applause, but Jake barely heard them. He was exhausted, drained by the intensity of the performance, and his hands were shaking from the effort of playing while channeling that much harmonic energy. Virolith rushed to his side, catching him as he swayed on his feet. "How?" she whispered. "How did you know that would work?" Jake managed a weak smile. "Dragons are creatures of harmony, right? I figured if I could create something beautiful enough, something that spoke to that part of your nature." Korath approached them, his expression thoughtful. "You did not defeat me with superior strength, human. You reminded me why we dragons fell in love with music in the first place. You showed me that there is more to power than the ability to destroy." He looked at his sister, then back at Jake. "If Virolith chooses to bond with you, she will have my blessing. Any being who can create such beauty is worthy of our family." 3 months later, Jake stood in the garden of a floating city above the dragon homeworld of Solarith Prime. The ceremony had been unlike anything he could have imagined, a blend of human and dragon traditions that lasted for 3 days and included beings from across the galaxy. As the binary suns set behind the crystalline mountains in the distance, Jake and Virolith exchanged vows that would bind them together for the next several centuries. The life extension process had been successfully completed, giving Jake a lifespan that would allow them to truly share a life together. "Any regrets?" Virolith asked as they stood together, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Jake thought about Earth, about the simple life he had left behind, about all the risks they had taken to reach this moment. "None," he said honestly. "Though I do have one request." "What's that?" Jake smiled and pulled out his guitar, which had become something of a legend throughout the galaxy after the events on the Celestial Dawn. "How about a song for our wedding night?" Viroleth's laughter was like music itself, warm and bright and full of love. "Play away, my husband. Play away." As Jake began to strum the opening chords of their new favorite song, dragons from across the city began to sing along, their voices creating a harmony that reached up to touch the stars themselves. And in that moment, surrounded by the music of 2 worlds coming together, Jake knew that some risks were worth taking after all. Some bridges were worth building, no matter how vast the space they had to cross. The music played on into the night, a song of love that transcended species and spanned the stars.